The rain hammered against the windows of Kensington Palace as Princess Diana walked slowly down the marble corridor, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. It was 3 weeks before that fateful August night in Paris, and something had changed in her demeanor. The staff noticed it immediately. There was a heaviness in her steps, a distant look in her usually bright eyes. James Morrison had been working as a royal protection officer for 8 years, but he had never seen the princess like this. She moved through the palace like someone carrying an invisible weight, stopping occasionally to stare out of windows or pause in doorways as if lost in thought. The media was relentless in their pursuit, camping outside the gates day and night, their cameras ready to capture every moment of her life. That particular evening, Diana had dismissed most of her staff early. The palace felt eerily quiet, with only the essential security personnel remaining on duty. James was conducting his regular rounds when he noticed light streaming from under the door of Diana's private study. It was well past midnight, unusual for someone who typically retired early to spend time with her sons. As he approached to ensure everything was secure, he heard the faint sound of papers rustling and what seemed like quiet sobbing. James hesitated, torn between his duty to protect and his respect for privacy. The princess had always been kind to the staff, remembering birthdays and asking about their families. She treated them as people, not just servants, which made moments like this particularly difficult to witness. The next morning brought no relief from the media circus. Photographers had somehow gotten closer to the palace grounds, their telephoto lenses pointed at every window. Diana's security team was on high alert, but she seemed almost resigned to the constant intrusion. During her morning walk through the palace gardens, she barely acknowledged the clicking of cameras from beyond the walls. James watched from his post as Diana sat alone on her favorite bench among the rose bushes. She held a letter in her hands, reading it over and over again. The wind caught a few strands of her blonde hair, and for a moment she looked younger than her 36 years. But there was something in her posture that spoke of exhaustion, of a woman who had been fighting battles on too many fronts for too long. The afternoon brought a series of official engagements that Diana navigated with her usual grace and charm. She smiled for the cameras, shook hands with dignitaries, and spoke eloquently about her charitable work. But James, trained to observe and protect, noticed the slight tremor in her hands and the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. As the day wore on, whispers began circulating among the palace staff. There were rumors of increased security concerns, of threats that went beyond the usual obsessed fans and paparazzi. Some spoke of strange phone calls and suspicious individuals who had been spotted near the palace. The Royal Protection Team had been briefed on new protocols, but the specifics were kept classified. That evening, as James prepared for another night shift, he found himself thinking about his own family. His wife Sarah was pregnant with their first child, and the thought of bringing a new life into a world where privacy seemed increasingly impossible weighed on his mind. He wondered how someone like Princess Diana, constantly in the public eye, managed to find moments of peace and normalcy. The clock struck 11 as James began his final rounds of the night. The palace had settled into its usual quiet rhythm, with only the occasional sound of footsteps in distant corridors or the soft hum of security equipment. He had almost completed his route when he noticed that the light was on again in Diana's study. This time, however, he could hear voices. Diana was speaking with someone, though he couldn't make out the words. As he moved closer to ensure the princess's safety, James realized that she was on the telephone. Her voice was low and urgent, punctuated by long pauses as she listened to whoever was on the other end. There was something in her tone that made him stop and listen more carefully, his training as a protection officer overriding his instinct to give her privacy. The conversation seemed to be coming to an end when James heard Diana say something that made his blood run cold. Her voice was clear and steady, but the words carried a finality that sent chills down his spine. He pressed himself against the wall, trying to process what he had just heard, wondering if he should report it to his superiors or if doing so would violate the trust that the princess had placed in all of them. Minutes passed before the study door opened, and Diana emerged looking pale and shaken. She walked past James without seeming to notice him, her mind clearly elsewhere. As she disappeared around the corner toward her private quarters, James remained frozen in place. replaying her words in his mind and trying to understand their significance. The weight of what he had overheard settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. As a protection officer, his job was to keep the princess safe, but how could he protect her from something she seemed to have already accepted as inevitable? The palace suddenly felt colder, and James found himself looking at every shadow with suspicion, wondering what forces were already in motion that none of them could stop. The following morning brought an unexpected development that would change everything James thought he knew about his role at the palace. Diana had requested a private meeting with him, something that had never happened in his 8 years of service. The message came through his supervisor, Detective Chief Inspector Williams, who seemed as puzzled as James by the unusual request. James knocked gently on the door of Diana's private sitting room, his heart racing with uncertainty. When her soft voice invited him in, he found her standing by the window, still in her morning robe, looking out at the photographers who had already assembled beyond the palace gates. The early morning light caught the auburn highlights in her hair, but her face looked drawn and tired. She turned to face him with that famous smile, but James could see the strain behind it. Diana had always possessed an uncanny ability to make everyone feel important and valued, but today there was something different in her demeanor. She gestured for him to sit in one of the comfortable armchairs while she remained standing, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The conversation began with small talk about his family, his wife's pregnancy, and his years of service. Diana had a remarkable memory for personal details about her staff, and she used this gift to put James at ease. She asked about his childhood in Yorkshire, his military background, and what had drawn him to protection work. For 20 minutes it felt like a normal conversation between two people, not a princess and her guard. But then Diana's tone shifted, becoming more serious and intimate. She moved to sit across from him, leaning forward slightly as if sharing a secret. She spoke about the pressures of royal life, the constant scrutiny, and the feeling of being trapped in a golden cage. James listened intently, unsure why she was confiding in him but honored by her trust. Diana then mentioned the phone call from the previous night, though she didn't reveal she knew he had overheard part of it. She spoke vaguely about receiving disturbing information, about feeling like she was being watched by forces beyond the usual media attention. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper as she described a growing sense of unease that had been building for weeks. James found himself in an impossible position. His training told him to report any security concerns immediately, but Diana had specifically asked that their conversation remain confidential. She looked directly into his eyes and asked if he had ever felt like he was part of something larger than himself, something that might require personal sacrifice for the greater good. The weight of her words settled between them like a heavy fog. James realized that Diana wasn't just seeking comfort or advice. She was preparing him for something. She spoke about her sons, William and Harry, and how important it was that they grow up knowing the truth about their mother, regardless of what others might say about her in the years to come. As their conversation continued, Diana revealed more about her recent discoveries. She had been investigating certain aspects of her divorce settlement and had uncovered information that made powerful people very uncomfortable. She mentioned names that James recognized from newspaper headlines and political circles, but she was careful not to be too specific about what she had learned. The princess then stood and walked to her desk, returning with a sealed envelope. She handed it to James, explaining that it contained information that might become important someday. She asked him to keep it safe and to open it only if something happened to her. The way she said "if something happens" made it clear that she considered it more of a when than an if. James stared at the envelope in his hands, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He tried to protest, to suggest that she should give such important information to someone higher up the chain of command, but Diana shook her head firmly. She explained that she trusted him specifically because he was observant but not ambitious, protective but not political. Their meeting was interrupted by a knock on the door, Diana's private secretary announcing that her car was ready for a scheduled engagement. As Diana prepared to leave, she placed her hand gently on James's shoulder and looked into his eyes one more time. She thanked him for his service and his discretion, then added something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The rest of James's shift passed in a blur of routine activities. but his mind kept returning to their conversation and the envelope now hidden in his locker. He found himself watching Diana more carefully during her public appearances, noticing things he had missed before. There was a brittleness to her smile, a tension in her posture that suggested someone living on borrowed time. That evening, James called his wife Sarah and found himself struggling to maintain normal conversation. How could he tell her about his fears without betraying Diana's confidence? How could he explain the growing sense of dread that seemed to follow him through the palace corridors? Sarah noticed his distraction and asked if everything was all right, but James could only offer vague reassurances. As the days passed, James began to notice subtle changes in the palace routine. Security protocols were adjusted, staff schedules were altered, and there seemed to be more meetings behind closed doors. The atmosphere became increasingly tense, though most of the staff attributed it to the ongoing media pressure surrounding Diana's relationship with Dodi Fayed. The envelope remained hidden in James's locker, but its presence weighed on him constantly. He found himself questioning every decision, every protocol, wondering if he was missing signs of impending danger. Sleep became elusive as he lay awake at night, replaying Diana's words and trying to understand what she had entrusted him with. 2 weeks before the Paris trip, Diana sought out James again during one of his patrols. This time their encounter was brief but even more intense. She simply walked up to him in a quiet corridor and whispered a single sentence that would echo in his mind forever. Then she walked away, leaving James standing alone in the shadows, finally understanding the true magnitude of what was about to unfold. The whispered words Diana had spoken to James in that quiet corridor were simple yet terrifying. "They will make it look like an accident, but you will know the truth." Those 9 words shattered James's world and transformed him from a loyal protection officer into a man carrying an unbearable secret. In the days that followed, James found himself studying every face in the palace with new suspicion. Colleagues he had worked alongside for years suddenly seemed like potential threats. He began noting unusual activities, conversations that stopped when he approached, and meetings that weren't on any official schedule. The paranoia was exhausting, but Diana's warning had awakened a protective instinct that went beyond his professional duties. James decided to conduct his own investigation, carefully and discreetly. He began paying closer attention to phone logs, visitor records, and security footage. What he discovered made his blood run cold. There were patterns he had missed before: unusual maintenance requests in areas near Diana's quarters, new staff members who seemed more interested in observing than working, and communication equipment that hadn't been there the previous month. The most disturbing discovery came when James accessed archived security footage from the past several weeks. He found gaps in the recordings, moments when cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned or been redirected. Someone with high-level access was creating blind spots in the palace's surveillance system, windows of time when activities could occur without being recorded. James also noticed changes in Diana herself during this period. She had always been emotional and expressive, but now there was a resigned calmness about her that was somehow more frightening than panic would have been. She moved through her daily routines with the careful precision of someone who knew each day might be her last. She spent extra time with William and Harry, hugging them longer and watching them with an intensity that broke James's heart. During one particularly difficult night shift, James made a decision that would haunt him forever. He approached Detective Chief Inspector Williams with some of his concerns, carefully omitting any mention of his private conversations with Diana. Williams listened patiently but ultimately dismissed James's worries as the natural result of working in a high-stress environment with constant media pressure. The response from his superior officer was both frustrating and revealing. Williams seemed unusually eager to discourage further investigation, suggesting that James might benefit from some time off, or perhaps a transfer to a less demanding assignment. The conversation left James feeling more isolated than ever, wondering if Williams was genuinely oblivious to the danger, or if he was part of the conspiracy Diana had discovered. As Diana's departure for Paris approached, James's anxiety reached a breaking point. He had been excluded from the protection detail for the trip, told that his services would be needed at the palace while she was away. This was unusual, as James had accompanied Diana on several previous international trips and was familiar with overseas security protocols. The night before Diana was scheduled to leave for Paris, she appeared at James's post during his late shift. She was dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, looking younger and more vulnerable than he had ever seen her. Without a word, she handed him a small key and pointed toward her private study. The message was clear. Whatever was in that room was now his responsibility to protect. After Diana disappeared back to her quarters, James used the key to enter her study. What he found there made him realize that the princess had been planning for this moment for weeks, perhaps months. The room contained carefully organized files, documents, and photographs that told a story of corruption and conspiracy reaching the highest levels of government and society. There were financial records showing massive payments to individuals whose names James recognized from newspaper headlines. There were photographs of clandestine meetings between people who publicly claimed to be enemies. Most disturbing of all, there were transcripts of recorded conversations that implicated powerful figures and activities that would destroy careers and topple governments if made public. But the most chilling discovery was a handwritten letter addressed to James himself. In Diana's elegant script, she had outlined exactly what she believed was going to happen to her and why. She explained that her investigation into certain financial irregularities had uncovered a network of individuals who would go to any length to protect their secrets. She had become a liability that could no longer be tolerated. The letter went on to detail specific instructions for James. If anything happened to her, he was to wait exactly 1 year before taking any action. This would allow the initial investigations and media attention to die down, making it safer for him to reveal what he knew. Diana had even prepared contact information for journalists and investigators she trusted, people who could help expose the truth without putting James's family at risk. As James read Diana's final words to him, he felt the full weight of the responsibility she was placing on his shoulders. She wrote about her love for William and Harry, her hope that they would someday understand why she had taken such risks, and her gratitude to James for being someone she could trust with the truth. She ended the letter with a simple but powerful statement. History will remember what really happened, because you will make sure it does. James carefully returned everything to its proper place and locked the study, but he knew that his life had been forever changed. He was no longer just a protection officer doing his job. He was now the keeper of secrets that could reshape history. The weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable, but Diana's trust in him gave him the strength to carry it. The next morning, as Diana prepared to leave for Paris, she caught James's eye one final time. She didn't speak, but her expression conveyed everything she needed to say. She was grateful, she was frightened, but most of all she was ready. James watched as her car disappeared through the palace gates, taking her toward a destiny that both of them now knew was inevitable. Standing alone in the courtyard, James made a silent promise to the woman who had trusted him with everything. Whatever happened in Paris, whatever lies were told afterward, he would make sure that someday the world would know the truth about Princess Diana and the forces that had conspired against her. The call came at 4:17 a.m. London time on August 31st, 1997. James was jolted awake by the shrill ring of his phone, and before he even answered, he knew. There was something in the urgency of the sound, the lateness of the hour, that told him his worst fears were about to be confirmed. When he heard Detective Chief Inspector Williams's voice on the other end, carefully controlled but strained, delivering the news of the crash in Paris, James felt his world collapse. William's words seemed to come from a great distance. There's been an accident. Princess Diana. The tunnel. She didn't survive. But even as James listened to the official version of events, he remembered Diana's whispered warning. They will make it look like an accident, but you will know the truth. The timing, the location, the circumstances, everything aligned with what Diana had feared would happen. James dressed quickly and drove to the palace, where he found chaos unlike anything he had ever experienced. Staff members were crying, phones were ringing constantly, and senior officials were rushing between meetings with grim expressions. The media had already descended like vultures, their camera crews setting up outside the gates to capture the nation's grief. But beneath the genuine sorrow, James detected something else, a sense of relief among certain individuals, as if a great problem had finally been solved. In the hours that followed, James watched as the official narrative took shape. The paparazzi were blamed for the aggressive pursuit that supposedly caused the crash. Driver Henry Paul was painted as drunk and reckless. Conspiracy theories were dismissed as the ravings of grief-stricken people who couldn't accept that sometimes tragedies were just random accidents. But James knew better. He had seen the evidence in Diana's study, read her letter, heard her fears. The most disturbing aspect of the aftermath was how quickly certain evidence disappeared. Security footage from the tunnel mysteriously malfunctioned. Key witnesses gave contradictory statements or suddenly became unavailable for interviews. The car itself was destroyed before a thorough independent examination could be conducted. To most people, these might have seemed like unfortunate coincidences, but to James they were signs of a cover-up in motion. James found himself in an impossible position. He possessed information that could change the entire investigation, but Diana's letter had been explicit. He must wait 1 year before taking any action. She had understood that immediate revelations would be dismissed as the fantasies of a grief-stricken employee, and that his own safety depended on appearing to accept the official story, while the conspirators were still alert and dangerous. The funeral was a particular ordeal for James. Standing, at attention as Diana's coffin passed by, he felt the weight of his secret knowledge like a physical pain. Millions of people around the world were mourning what they believed was a tragic accident, while he alone knew that they were actually witnessing the aftermath of a carefully orchestrated assassination. The sight of young William and Harry walking behind their mother's coffin nearly broke his resolve to remain silent. In the weeks following the funeral, James noticed that several changes were made to palace security protocols. New staff members appeared, and some longtime employees were reassigned or chose to retire early. The official explanation was that these changes were routine updates following a thorough security review, but James recognized them for what they really were: efforts to remove anyone who might have seen too much or asked inconvenient questions. James himself was approached about a transfer to a prestigious position with increased responsibilities and a significant pay raise. The offer was presented as a reward for his years of loyal service, but James understood that it was actually an attempt to move him away from the palace and the evidence hidden in Diana's study. He politely declined, citing his pregnant wife's need for stability, but he knew he was now being watched more closely. The media coverage of Diana's death evolved exactly as James had expected. Initial questions about the circumstances gradually gave way to celebrations of her humanitarian legacy. Investigative journalists who had started asking difficult questions found their access restricted or their stories killed by editors. The paparazzi narrative became accepted truth, and anyone who suggested otherwise was labeled a conspiracy theorist. During this period, James began preparing for the day when he would finally be able to reveal what he knew. He secretly copied the documents from Diana's study, storing them in multiple secure locations. He researched the journalists and investigators Diana had mentioned in her letter, learning about their backgrounds and assessing their credibility. Most importantly, he documented everything he had observed before, during, and after Diana's death, creating a detailed timeline that would support the evidence she had left behind. The hardest part was maintaining a normal life while carrying such an enormous secret. His wife Sarah gave birth to their daughter Emily just 3 months after Diana's death, and James found himself looking at his newborn child and wondering what kind of world he was bringing her into. The joy of fatherhood was mixed, with the terrible knowledge of how easily powerful people could destroy innocent lives when it served their purposes. James also had to deal with the psychological impact of his unique position. He suffered from nightmares, anxiety attacks, and periods of deep depression as he struggled to process what he had learned about the true nature of power and corruption in British society. Several times he came close to breaking down and revealing everything, but Diana's letter always reminded him that patience was essential for both success and survival. As the first anniversary of Diana's death approached, James began making contact with the people Diana had identified as trustworthy. He sent anonymous messages suggesting that they might be interested in new information about the princess's death, carefully gauging their responses without revealing his identity or the nature of what he possessed. The responses convinced him that Diana had chosen her contacts wisely. These were people who would pursue the truth regardless of personal consequences. On August 30th, 1998, exactly 1 year after Diana's final conversation with him, James made his way to her sealed study one last time. Using the key she had given him, he retrieved the documents and evidence that would soon change everything the world thought it knew about the death of the people's princess. As he closed the door behind him, James whispered a promise to Diana that he had repeated every day for the past year. "The truth will come out. I won't let them bury it with you." The next phase of James's mission was about to begin, and he knew there would be no turning back. He was about to go up against some of the most powerful people in the world, armed only with Diana's evidence and his own unwavering commitment to honor her trust. The Lonely Guard was about to become the most important witness in one of the most significant cover-ups in modern history. The revelation began slowly, like ripples spreading across a calm pond. James had chosen his first contact carefully, investigative journalist Sarah Mitchell, whose reputation for integrity and courage was legendary in British media circles. Their initial meeting took place in a small cafe in Hampstead Heath, chosen specifically because its location and layout made surveillance difficult while allowing for quick exits if necessary. Sarah had arrived, expecting another conspiracy theorist with wild claims and forged documents. Instead, she found herself sitting across from a soft-spoken man whose detailed knowledge of palace security protocols and intimate familiarity with Diana's personal habits convinced her within minutes that his story was genuine. When James produced Diana's handwritten letter and the first batch of supporting documents, Sarah's journalistic instincts told her she was looking at the story of a lifetime. The process of verification took months. Sarah assembled a small team of trusted colleagues and forensic experts who could authenticate the documents without alerting the subjects of the investigation. The handwriting analysis confirmed that Diana had indeed written the letter to James. The financial records checked out against independently obtained information. Most significantly, several of the photographs contained details that had never been made public, proving their authenticity. But with each document they verified, James and Sarah realized they were dealing with a conspiracy far more extensive than either had imagined. The network of individuals involved included members of Parliament, senior intelligence officers, wealthy businessmen, and even members of the royal household itself. Diana hadn't simply stumbled across a minor scandal. She had uncovered evidence of systematic corruption that reached the highest levels of British society. The most damaging revelation concerned Diana's investigation into certain charitable organizations that were being used to launder money for arms dealers and corrupt politicians. Diana had discovered that millions of pounds donated for humanitarian causes were actually funding weapons sales to unstable regions, creating the very crises that the charities claimed to be addressing. Her threat to expose this operation had made her a target that couldn't be ignored or silenced through conventional means. As Sarah's investigation progressed, James began noticing signs that their activities had been detected. His phone calls were experiencing unusual static and delays. His mail was arriving later than usual, sometimes with signs of having been opened and resealed. Most troubling of all, he spotted the same unfamiliar faces near his home and workplace on multiple occasions. The hunters had become the hunted. The pressure intensified when Sarah's editor at The Guardian suddenly killed her story without explanation, citing insufficient evidence despite months of careful documentation. Other major newspapers refused to even look at the materials, claiming they had policies against publishing conspiracy theories. It became clear that the same forces that had silenced Diana were now working to prevent the truth from reaching the public. Undeterred, James and Sarah decided to take their story international. They made contact with journalists in France, Germany, and the United States, who had the resources and independence to pursue the investigation without interference from British authorities. The response was encouraging. Several major publications expressed serious interest in the story and began conducting their own verification processes. However, the international approach brought new dangers. James received his first direct threat in the form of a phone call at 3 a.m., during which an unidentified voice calmly informed him that accidents could happen to anyone, including family members. The caller knew details about James's daughter Emily that could only have come from close surveillance: her school, her favorite playground, even her teacher's name. Sarah faced her own pressures. Her apartment was burglarized, with only her computer equipment and research notes stolen while valuable items were left untouched. She was followed home from work and received mysterious packages containing photographs of her taken without her knowledge. The message was clear: they were being watched, and their activities could be stopped at any time. Despite the intimidation, both James and Sarah pressed forward, driven by their commitment to Diana's memory and their belief that the truth needed to be told. They developed elaborate security protocols, communicating through encrypted channels and meeting in different locations each time. James moved his family to a safe house arranged by Sarah's international contacts, while she temporarily relocated to a secure facility provided by a German newspaper. The breakthrough came when a former intelligence officer, motivated by James's courage in coming forward, agreed to verify some of the more sensitive documents. This individual, known only as Thames, confirmed that several of the operations described in Diana's files were genuine intelligence activities that had been conducted without proper authorization or oversight. Thames also revealed that Diana had been under surveillance for months before her death, and that her movements in Paris had been tracked in real time. With Thames's corroboration, the international media finally had enough confidence to move forward with the story. Coordinated publications were planned for newspapers in 5 different countries, making it impossible for British authorities to suppress all coverage simultaneously. The evidence would be released gradually over several weeks, allowing time for each revelation to be absorbed and for additional sources to come forward. But as the publication date approached, James received the most chilling message yet. A package arrived at his safe house containing a single photograph: Diana's car in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer had been positioned there before the crash occurred. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "Some secrets should stay buried." The photograph was more than just a threat. It was proof that Diana's death had indeed been carefully orchestrated and documented by her killers. The image showed details that had never been included in official investigation reports, confirming that there had been witnesses to the crash who had never come forward or been identified by French authorities. James now held physical evidence of the cover-up, but possessing it also made him a marked man. As James stared at the photograph, he realized that Diana's final words to him had been both a warning and a prophecy. She had known that revealing the truth would be dangerous, but she had also known that someone had to be willing to take that risk. Now, with publication just days away, James understood that he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. The lonely guard who had once stood silently in palace corridors was about to become the most important witness in modern British history. But first, he would have to survive long enough to tell his story to the world. The final phase of Diana's plan was about to unfold, and James knew that everything, his life, his family's safety, and Diana's legacy, depended on what happened next. The world changed on March 15, 1999, when 5 major international newspapers simultaneously published James's story under the headline, "The Diana Files, a Royal Guard's Evidence." Within hours, the revelations had spread across every news network and website globally, creating a media earthquake that dwarfed even the original coverage of Diana's death. James had prepared for this moment for nearly 2 years, but nothing could have readied him for the intensity of the response. His carefully documented evidence, supported by Diana's own handwritten letter and authenticated by multiple independent experts, shattered the official narrative that had been accepted by millions around the world. The photograph from the tunnel, enhanced by forensic specialists, revealed details that made it impossible to maintain that Diana's death had been a simple accident. The immediate reaction was explosive. British government officials vehemently denied all allegations, calling the story a malicious fabrication by conspiracy theorists and disgruntled former employees. Several of the individuals named in Diana's documents disappeared from public view, with their representatives citing family emergencies or pre-planned vacations. The stock market plummeted as investors fled companies connected to the scandal. Within 48 hours of publication, James received word that formal investigations had been launched by authorities in France, Germany, and the United States. The FBI announced that it was reviewing new evidence related to American citizens and companies named in the documents. Interpol issued warrants for several individuals who had fled their home countries rather than face questioning about their roles in the conspiracy. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Prince Charles himself requested a private meeting with James, conducted under the supervision of international observers to ensure transparency. During this extraordinary encounter, Charles listened gravely as James recounted his conversations with Diana and presented additional evidence that hadn't been included in the initial publications. What emerged from that meeting, though the details were never made fully public, was Charles's admission that he had suspected Diana was in danger, but had been powerless to protect her. He revealed that his own attempts to investigate threats against Diana had been blocked by palace officials, and that he had been told her security concerns were being addressed through appropriate channels. Charles's devastation upon learning the truth was reportedly so profound that he required medical attention. The royal family's response marked a turning point in the story's reception. Rather than closing ranks to protect the institution, they cooperated fully with international investigators and publicly supported James's right to reveal what he had learned. Queen Elizabeth II, in a statement that shocked the world, declared that the truth must be pursued regardless of its impact on individuals or institutions, effectively ending official resistance to the investigation. The legal proceedings that followed were unprecedented in their scope and complexity. Courts in multiple countries issued indictments against dozens of individuals, including former cabinet ministers, intelligence officials, and business leaders. The charitable money laundering scheme was exposed in detail, leading to the closure of several major organizations and the recovery of millions of pounds that were redirected to legitimate humanitarian causes. James found himself at the center of this legal storm, testifying before parliamentary committees, grand juries, and international tribunals. His quiet life as a protection officer had been replaced by the role of primary witness in one of the most significant corruption cases in modern history. The pressure was enormous, but James drew strength from the knowledge that he was finally honoring Diana's trust and revealing the truth she had died trying to expose. The personal cost, however, was severe. Despite round-the-clock protection provided by international law enforcement, James and his family lived in constant fear of retaliation. Several attempts were made to discredit him through false accusations and fabricated evidence, but the international nature of the investigation and the quality of Diana's documentation protected him from the worst attacks. Sarah Mitchell, his journalistic partner in exposing the truth, won a Pulitzer Prize for her coverage but also paid a heavy price. Her career in British media was effectively ended, as major publications blacklisted her despite the global recognition of her work. She eventually relocated to the United States, where she established a foundation dedicated to investigating corruption and protecting whistleblowers. The long-term impact of the revelations was profound and lasting. The British intelligence services underwent major reforms, with new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent unauthorized operations. Several members of Parliament were forced to resign, and public trust in government institutions reached historic lows. Most importantly, Diana's humanitarian work was vindicated and expanded, with new organizations established in her name to continue the causes she had championed. For James personally, the years following the revelations were a mixture of satisfaction and profound loss. He had succeeded in honoring Diana's final request, but the process had cost him his career, his privacy, and his sense of security. He could never return to the simple life of a palace guard, as his face had become known worldwide, and his safety remained a constant concern. The most meaningful moment came 5 years after the story broke, when Prince William, now an adult, requested a private meeting with James. During their emotional encounter, William thanked James for his courage in revealing the truth about his mother's death. He shared that learning the real circumstances, while painful, had given him closure and allowed him to properly honor Diana's memory. William also revealed that he and Harry had established a private fund to support the families of other whistleblowers who risked everything to expose corruption. James eventually wrote a book about his experiences, titled The Last Conversation: A Guard's Promise to Princess Diana. The proceeds were donated entirely to charity, following Diana's example of using public attention to benefit others. The book became an international bestseller, but more importantly, it inspired other individuals with knowledge of wrongdoing to come forward, creating a wave of accountability that extended far beyond the original conspiracy. On the 10th anniversary of Diana's death, James stood once again in the palace courtyard where he had watched her car disappear for the final time. But this time he wasn't alone. Hundreds of people had gathered for a memorial service honoring not just Diana's life, but her commitment to truth and justice. Among them were other whistleblowers, investigative journalists, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by James's example to stand up against corruption in their own communities. As James looked out at the crowd, he thought about Diana's final words to him. "They will make it look like an accident, but you will know the truth." She had been right about the cover-up, but she had also been right about something else, that one person with the courage to speak out could change everything. The lonely guard who had once stood silently in palace shadows had become the voice that ensured Princess Diana's truth would never be forgotten. The legacy of that night when Diana took James aside continued to resonate years later. Legislation was passed in multiple countries strengthening protections for whistleblowers. University courses were created studying the case as an example of how corruption could be exposed through careful documentation and international cooperation. Most importantly, Diana's sons had grown up knowing the truth about their mother's courage and sacrifice, allowing them to carry forward her humanitarian mission with full knowledge of what she had died trying to achieve. James never forgot Diana's trust in him, and he spent the rest of his life working to ensure that other voices of truth would be heard and protected. The princess who had lived her life in the public eye had chosen a quiet guard to be her final advocate, and in doing so, had proven that sometimes the most powerful revelations come from the most unexpected sources. Her last words had indeed left him speechless, but they had also given him the strength to speak truths that changed the world.